no, thank you very much, Corey, for having me back. We were here at your meeting back in the fall with the 3 schools, UNC, University of Colorado at Colorado Springs, and ACC, which are our 3 pilot sites that were funded partially by the legislature and partly by our group to develop inclusive education pilot sites at our universities and community colleges. So it's really exciting. When we were here in the fall, we were maybe 6 weeks into the school year and had with big, bright ideas, a lot of great visions for what to do. And then now the students have just finished their freshman year. And I think everyone's still very excited about the possibilities in Colorado. We also learned a lot. As you know, from developing a new program, there's a lot of learning and readjusting that goes along in the first year. So why don't we start out with the video, and then I'll say a few things about how the year went, and then maybe just open it up to questions mostly. Does that sound good? Okay.
Across the country who had opportunities for students with intellectual disabilities. Until last year, Colorado was one of a few handful of states that did not have such opportunities. For the first time in our history, students with intellectual disabilities had the opportunity to go to college. The 3 pilot sites are at the University of Northern Colorado, University of Colorado at Colorado Springs, and Arapahoe Community College. We're not going to be recreating a special education room on a college campus. Students will be on campus, fully matriculated, and will have all the rights and responsibilities as any other student.
The idea of inclusiveness, no matter where we are, is that we're going to support all people to be a part of our community. It is about the right of people with disabilities to be educated alongside everyone else, to recreate alongside everyone else, to work alongside everyone else.
The university has really taken on the challenge of growing a new program such as UNC Goal. It has opened its arms to inclusive environment, so faculty have opened their arms to introducing students with intellectual and developmental disabilities into their classroom.
Our students take any courses from Introduction to Recreation, Tourism, and Hospitality to Introduction to Communication. They're all over the board. So that's been something that's been really fun for me because I get to work with a variety of different departments on campus, and everyone has a different perspective of what goal is and what we're doing and the way that it's impacting campus.
Oh, it's like a renewed hope that there's really good people out there doing good things that believe in people with disabilities, and I think that's hopeful. And I think being able to say to families, as we work with families with younger kids, that college is a possibility and great things are happening in colleges, and great things are happening in colleges in Colorado. And I think we haven't been able to say that before, so to be able to say it now means a lot.
College for me has always been a lifelong dream, and the fact that I get to go here is an honor. I am studying on camera, which allows me to be on camera and to make movies or do commercials for myself. And it's been a wild ride, but I enjoy the class.
Students who are here receiving services from our office have really kind of a typical day of any college student. They go to classes of their choosing. When they come to us, we start to work with them on what their area of study should be. So what are they interested in? What are they good at? And start to just really, as any college student would start to develop a major, we work to develop an area of study for them.
I want to start my own business. So I'm going to get my certificate and then maybe my associate's, probably my associate's degree. If I was not in college, I would probably be doing nothing right now, like sitting at home, playing video games, not really advancing in life or doing anything I want to do.
Seeing the students grow mainly in self-determination has been the highlight for me. Just because self-determination is choices. It's not what your parents want or what your friends want or what your teacher wants. I try to push, what do you want?
I'm actually a teacher at home. I'm teaching my family do's and don'ts.
To learn new things, to learn about how to communicate. We had communication class, and that was hard, but it was good because we learned more how to communicate with others.
My dream job is working on cars because I work on the change of oil and stuff, and the brakes and the tires.
To have like hands-on like training and learning new skills.
We cannot put limits to people. You know, so in a community, you have people that say that, well, so-and-so can't do this or so-and-so shouldn't do that without asking the person. With our students, they're the ones that say, I want to do this and I will do this. And they can because they want to and because they have that strength and that drive to do it.
10 years from now, parents and kids with intellectual disabilities, they have all the options that traditional college students have. When they're a senior in high school, they're getting ready to graduate, they can look across the state and see, where do I want to go? What do I want to do? And which school is best for me? Hopefully UNC is that school. If not, I hope there's a lot of other options for them.
It is our duty and our responsibility to make sure that all people with intellectual disabilities have the opportunity to pursue their dreams after high school and become contributing members of their community. Just watch us.
Just watch us.
Watch us.
Just watch us.
Just watch us.
Watch us.
Just watch us.
Just watch us.
Watch us.
Just watch us.
Just watch us.
Really happy. I love college.
Okay, so that's who we are. That's our first year. And as you can see, I guess the themes running through that are inclusion, endless possibilities, self-determination, and that's where we're going. And that's what we want to see in Colorado. We're starting with 3 schools. Our vision is to see a day when every college and every university in Colorado has a pathway for students with intellectual disabilities. And I think you can see some pretty dedicated people in that video that probably won't stop until they see that happen. So it's really been an encouraging year. It's been a year of learning. The students this year were pretty varied in their interests. I mean, you saw Mia doing sign language. She wants to be a sign language instructor in the school system. Another young man that said he wanted to be an entrepreneur wants to work in gaming, and he's very, very talented in computers and video games and video development. And Nick, you saw wiping the buses, wants to be in somewhere in mechanics. And so they've got a really neat thing set up for him, because part of the college experience is going to be their academics, which the academic track is they take 2 classes per semester, plus 1 independence life skill related class, and then also job training while they're in during their 4 years at school. And so for Nick, they set up they've connected him up with the maintenance fleet at the UCCS campus, and he's learning a lot of things in the mechanical field on keeping their police cars, keeping their buses, all of that up and running. So he's had a great year. I'm trying to think what else. One more thing I want to just say is they want it to be fully inclusive, fully normative. UNC started this year with residential living. All their students lived on campus. UCCS is also a residential university. The first year, all their students were day students, but starting next year, they're going to have an on-campus opportunity also. So I probably won't talk too much. I'll just maybe open it up to questions so I know what you guys want to hear about. Anything?
Might mention how many are enrolled for fall.
Oh, for next year?
We have 35, right?
Right, yep. We started with 11 the first year, and now we have a freshman and a sophomore class, so they're up to 35. And the goal at the universities is to have 10 students per year, so 40 per year. And then community college, I think, will expand greater than that. I guess maybe one other thing that we're working on when you say, what's the end goal here? The end goal is to leave college with a piece of paper that's a credential that has some meaning to go out into the job force and work with. And that's something, we have an inclusion consortium which in the 3 pilot schools, the Department of Higher Education, and Corey from JFK are all part of a consortium. And we're working on creating a credential that's going to be statewide and that will start to have meaning out in the community, out with businesses, so to help students. Oh, sorry.
I was just wondering, this on? Oh, about financial support.
Okay. Students pay tuition similar to any other student going to the college or the university, but we do have 2 options. There are a fair amount of scholarships available throughout the country, and you can find them on any of the 3 schools' websites or on our websites. There's a link to scholarships. Also, a really great thing, the U.S. Department of Education has set up something called a CTP certification, and as part of our funding through the legislature, each school is required to fulfill that and get their certification. And when they do, it'll open up all the federal financial aid to those students as any other student going to a university. So they'll have Pell Grants, federal financial aid, work study open to them. And they're all working on it this summer, and I would imagine by the end of the summer, they should all have that completed. Any other questions? Okay, thank you guys so much for inviting me. All right.
Okay. So as you see, we've got a very full agenda this morning. So I'm going to turn the microphone over to Mary Jo, who's going to give us a legislative update, something that's become pretty much a tradition in leading off our CANDO meetings. So really appreciate her being here to do this.
Thank you, Corey. Were these handed out? Okay. Okay. I'm Mary Jo Reamer with the ARC of Colorado. The legislative session ended just about exactly a month ago, and the governor will sign, not sign, or veto all the bills that pass both chambers by late today. The document that was distributed to you indicates the status of that legislation as of just this week on Tuesday. This was an interesting session, and every legislative session is. Colorado's economy, as you well know, has rebounded, and that's a mixed blessing for us in that because of the Taxpayer Bill of Rights, the state, to make it as simple as I can, is not allowed to spend all the tax dollars it collects, depending on what the economic situation is at the moment. So this year, we were faced again with the prospect of refunds going back to taxpayers, which doesn't occur in the form of a check in the mail. It's that the state income tax level fluctuates depending on what the status is of what we call TABOR refunds. And one of the last bills that passed during the session helped address some of those problems by allowing Colorado to keep money that it collects by determining that the hospital provider fee dollars, and I don't know if all of you know what that is, but the hospital provider fee is a mechanism wherein all hospitals in Colorado that accept patients who have Medicaid benefits actually pay a certain amount to the state, and that money that goes to the state Medicaid agency is then matched by federal dollars, which allows a pool of dollars to build up to put more money into Medicaid to allow more patients who have Medicaid benefits to be seen. And the revenue from the hospital provider fee in the past has just gone into the general fund. Therefore, it's part of all the dollars that the state takes in taxes and is subject to TABOR refunds. And this year, the legislature at the last minute, after a lot of bruised egos and probably a few bruised arms, agreed that the money from the hospital provider fee could be considered as an enterprise fund, and therefore it isn't subject to TABOR refunds. And that's somewhat of a complicated explanation, but if you are really interested, and I would encourage everybody who's interested in Colorado public policy to learn about it, go to the Colorado Fiscal Institute website and do everything you can to educate yourself about it, because we are unique in the country in that we cannot spend all the tax dollars that we collect. So with that as a backdrop, the upshot is, in terms of bills that required extra allocations and extra appropriations, there weren't many, to put it mildly. There were almost none. But it was a good session in many other ways, and a number of issues that the legislature tackled, in which we were very interested, were successful. And fortunately, we were able to get a few things done that resulted in bipartisan support. One, and there was bills signed just this week and last week that we worked very hard on. One is the establishment of a pilot program to create an Office of Public Guardianship in Colorado. We're, again, one of the few states that doesn't have an Office of Public Guardianship. So if the courts determine that a person needs a guardian, the options available to the court are to try to track down family, and usually in those cases where a judge has intervened, there isn't any family, or find an organization such as the ARC to provide guardianship for an individual, and in some cases seek out private guardianship, which is fairly expensive. So legislation was passed to create a pilot program. I think there will be 3 offices, one in a rural area, one in a suburban area, and one in an urban area, to determine whether or not we can actually roll out a statewide Office of Public Guardianship. Interestingly enough, this was a bill that would have required, don't hold me to this, I think $3 million in funding to establish, but there was no appropriation, and it's funded through, the Colorado term is gifts, grants, and donations. And as of the day the bill was signed, which was just this past week, the Colorado Bar Association had actually raised the money to fund it. So the Office of Public Guardianship will go forward. There were 3 bills that we worked on that deal with school discipline. 1 was successful and 2 were not. The first is legislation that would have banned corporal punishment in Colorado public schools. That was House Bill 1038. Colorado is unique, again, in that school districts have significant local control about policies and practices, and the State Board of Education and the State, Department of Education doesn't have the same degree of influence over school districts as in other states. So each district can establish their own policies about school discipline, curriculum, graduation requirements, any number of things. And corporal punishment is allowed in Colorado schools. We didn't, but with the support from the Colorado Center on Law and Policy, as well as the Disability Law Colorado, promoted legislation that would have banned corporal punishment statewide. It was not successful, and the issue, again, was local control. A second bill that we thought had a greater chance of success but didn't is legislation that would have eliminated the practice of suspending or expelling young students, kids between preschool and 2nd grade. To me, the idea of expelling a 2nd grader is appalling. I can't believe there's any reason why you would do that. But the legislation would have required the schools to go through any number of other kinds of steps and remediation to help a student stay in school. That, again, ended up failing, and it was a local control issue. But the good news is that House Bill 1276 that bans prone restraint in Colorado schools did pass. And it bans prone restraint, which, as you know, is face-down restraints. It also puts into law reporting requirements around any forms of seclusion and restraint for students that previously were in Colorado rules. And it sets up an appeal process so that families have a formal way of challenging school discipline measures around seclusion and restraint. Another major piece of legislation that we've worked on, I have been involved with for 10 years, but actually it dates back to 1996 in terms of actually attempts to get it into Colorado law, is a bill that separates case management from service provision in the DD system. It's House Bill 1343. It was sponsored by the Joint Budget Committee and actually passed pretty easily once we finally got a bill on a piece of paper in dealing with all of the compromises that had to be made to satisfy particularly some of the smaller and rural community-centered boards. And it establishes a process over the next 4 years where community-centered boards will have to make a choice as to whether they want to continue as case management agencies and service providers, which they can do, but not for the same person. Or they can make a decision that they want to change their business model and focus on case management, or focus just on service provision. And the anticipation is that there will be case management agencies established throughout the state who will be in the business of just providing case management. That is a major piece of legislation that probably will result in some significant system change over time. There were another of pieces of legislation that may not seem really significant, but they're issues that we've worked on and off over the years and really do make a big difference. One is House Bill 1046 that updates Colorado statutes and removes all references to the terms mental retardation and mental deficit or mentally deficient from Colorado law. About 8 years ago, legislation was passed that we called the People First language. It said moving forward in Colorado law and rules, language had to refer to people first, not their disability. And this sort of closes the loop on that and actually requires the state legislative council to go in and revise all Colorado statutes and any remaining law that uses those terms. Another piece of legislation that, again, doesn't seem like a big deal, but is one that we also have worked hard on, was House Bill 1188. Colorado has a bias crimes law that if a crime is committed against someone based on their race, ethnicity, some other factor that leads to, that could be construed as bias, that penalties for people convicted for those crimes are greater than if they were just a typical mugging, I guess. But interestingly enough, disability and gender identification were never part of the original law. So legislation was introduced and passed this year, say if you commit a crime against someone and it's evident that you are biased against that person because of his or her disability, you can be penalized the same as if you had committed that crime against a person based on race. Another piece of legislation that we worked on, sorry that I have most of this stuff memorized until about a week ago. Is House Bill 1253. And the bill title is Protecting Seniors Against Financial Abuse, but it includes all at-risk adults. And it's intended to help address some of the scams that are perpetrated against both seniors as well as other at-risk individuals in financial planning and a number of other things that unfortunately people who don't have a lot of outside guidance get scammed over. We managed to get another bill that I know has been worked on at least 9 years, and that is requiring background checks for people who serve at-risk adults. All service providers are required to do criminal background checks on people that they hire, but until recently they weren't required, until this bill went into effect or goes into effect, to do adult protective services checks. And as you may know, abuse and neglect against particularly people with cognitive and intellectual disabilities, as well as some other at-risk people, are often hard to substantiate. So if adult protective services is called and they do an investigation, they may not have enough information, or the credibility of the victim may not be taken seriously to get the case into court, but a record is still maintained. And until now, there was no legal way for employers to access information through adult protective services to determine if claims had been lodged against an individual. And this bill came about starting with a situation in 2007 when then Representative Gwen Green, who was from Jefferson County, had a constituent call her very concerned about her sister, over whom she had guardianship, who had been with an agency, and a person that was providing services for her had, without a doubt, both physically and emotionally abused her, and was subsequently terminated. Colorado's an at-will employment state, and you can let people go if you don't like the way they part their hair, but was let go and then was hired by someone else. Well, the someone else turned out, if you can believe this, the state of Colorado at the Wheat Ridge Regional Center. And the state itself did not have any way of checking to see whether or not complaints through adult protection services had been lodged. That's where this whole bill started. And it took 10 years, but we got it passed. And now employers are required to check APS. They can still hire someone if they want to, but they are required to check adult protective services before they make a final decision about hiring. Again, the number of crimes that are actually prosecuted against at-risk adults in Colorado is frightfully small, and that's the case everywhere, because the credibility of witnesses, the availability of backup, credibility of the victim themselves are often questioned. So we were really pleased about that legislation. And I'd be glad to answer any questions about what I've discussed or any of the other pieces of legislation that are identified in this summary. One last piece of legislation that I don't know if it was signed yesterday or not, but that is also a major issue, is legislation that reforms the Colorado Division of Youth Corrections. You may have read, there were several stories in the Post as well as in other newspapers around the state about some egregious treatment of young people who are in one of the correctional facilities around Colorado. And this legislation requires the state to move toward truly a rehabilitative as opposed to strictly focused correctional system. And in fact, it even changes the name of the division. It's no longer the Division of Youth Corrections, it's the Division of Youth Services. And that bill hadn't been signed as of yesterday, but I spoke with the sponsor the day before, and he was comfortable that the governor would probably sign it. That sets forth a plan that requires the department to work with stakeholders, which includes the developmental disability community, and inordinate number of kiddos who end up in the correctional system likely have developmental disabilities. So it requires the department to work with all of us and others to change the focus of treatment of kids that end up in the correctional system. So, any questions or? Yes.
Legislation, is this on?
Mental health holds?
Yeah, because that passed too, didn't it?
It did.
Okay.
It would actually, it changes. Last year, the governor vetoed legislation that would have allowed 72-hour mental health holds if a person hadn't been actually arrested or accused of a crime. And so what this new legislation, it doesn't really do much, but it does put forth the requirement that you cannot hold a person in a jail on a mental health hold, and it opens the door to allow more hospitals in Colorado to actually accept persons who are in need of a psychiatric hold.
Does it set aside funding for the hospitals to
yes.
increase capacity for mental
Yes.
holds? Okay.
Yeah, not enough. One of the issues that we hope to work on next year, and it may take more than a year, is reforming our system of Medicaid waivers for children, particularly those who need out-of-home placement. And currently, the system set up through statute as well as through rule leaves very few recourses for families who really need temporary, and temporary can be many years, ability to have a young person with significant behavioral and developmental issues to be supported and served out of the family home. And without going through the foster care system, it's almost impossible to get that kind of support. And we need to do a lot to work with our counties, to work with departments of human services, and certainly with the legislature to find the funding to make sure that when out-of-home placement is needed, that it can be done in an appropriate and not a correctional or punishment mode. So, and without families having to voluntarily give up parental rights. So, one thing that we also need to work on in the coming years are Medicaid rates. Again, it's wonderful that we have no waiting list for children's waivers or for supported living services, but we know that there aren't enough providers to take care of people, whether they're on a waiting list or not, especially those with really high needs. So over time, Medicaid rates throughout Colorado have got to be adjusted. And we're all hoping, and I urge every one of you to call every hour if you wish, Senator Gardner's office and Senator Bennett as well, and to let them know that the American Health Care Act as it currently stands is not good for people with disabilities. We need no cuts, no caps. And Carol Meredith and I have spoken about this a little bit this week. I think our message shouldn't be about whining about don't cut my benefits. Our message should be that the Medicaid benefits that people who live in the community receive is a civil rights issue. That without those supports and services, especially through Medicaid waivers, people will not be able to live in the community and to be able to contribute and function as citizens like the rest of us. And it shouldn't be about cutting benefits. It's about my right, your right to live in the community, to have friends, to socialize, to even work. Because without those supports, many people couldn't. we're really honored this week that the board of directors of an organization called Self-Advocates Becoming Empowered, which is a national organization of self-advocates with developmental disabilities, is meeting in Denver. In fact, they're meeting at the Arc of Colorado. And tonight, they and a number of other groups from around the city are going to Elitch's, so it should be a really great time. But yesterday, in informal conversation with some of the leading self-advocates from all over the country, they talked about that. And their issue was, without the Medicaid waivers at the level I have, I'll end up in a nursing home, and I don't want to be there. I would rather be able to fly to Denver and go to a meeting. So as you talk to legislators and to friends, please emphasize the civil rights aspect of the terrible impact that cutting Medicaid will have for people you love. And if you have any more questions, I'd be glad to answer them. Thanks.
Thanks so much. Mary Jo, can I just get you the, because we tape these presentations.
I'm leaving to go to Grand Junction, the opening ceremony for Colorado Special Olympics Summer Games today. And
safe travels.
Yes.
Okay. So thanks so much. And still on the theme of legislation this year, Sarah Davidan's going to talk to us about what we know about restraint and seclusion in schools. So Sarah. This here. You can do it after if you like.
Okay.
There it is. All right. Okay.
I should just sign it now. Although I should wait and see if I really want this recorded. Do I need to do something to get this to pop up, or? Oh, hi, everybody. I unfortunately don't have a nice cheery topic to talk about, but I think there are some cheery things that we can think about that we can do. And if, for me, I know taking action and being able to know that you're moving something forward cheers me up a little bit. So even though the topic of physical restraint in children isn't a light one, I think there are some things that we can do to really help move things forward so that we're mitigating these practices. So that's what I want to talk about. So I want to start, is this all right? So I want to start with the a little bit of information about that came out of the President's New Freedom Commission a number of years ago. This isn't current. On mental health, it said restraint and seclusion pose significant risks, including serious injury, death, re-traumatizing of people with a history of trauma or abuse, loss of dignity, and other psychological harm. But despite these dangers, the Government Accountability Office has did a study in 2010 and then did some follow-up reporting on this, that there are no federal laws, and there still today are no federal laws that restrict the use of seclusion and restraint in public and private schools. And the laws that do exist at the state level are widely divergent. So something to think about as I go through some of the other information that I want to talk about today and what's happening in Colorado. So I've been working on policy and practice change related to discipline of students for about probably a little bit over 10 years now in Colorado. And my work started looking at expulsions of young children because of what was considered behavioral difficulties. So, so even though my initial focus was on expulsion from schools, I realized more recently, and through my work at JFK Partners, so I'm faculty at JFK Partners, And so through my work at JFK Partners, looking at discipline issues and children with disabilities in the public school system, I also began looking at sort of other kinds of kind of discipline practices that aren't considered discipline practices. And seclusion and restraint are two of those kinds of practices. In Colorado and in most states, they're not considered discipline, they're considered safety measures. And so I was interested enough in what's happening or not happening in our state around restraint policies and practices in mitigating restraint that I ended up just completing a doctoral dissertation on the topic. So both in my work at JFK Partners as well as in my other academic work, this became a top priority for me. So that's kind of where I'm coming into this with sort of my interest in the topic. And in particular, I've really been sort of wanting to look at, what can we do to help? Sometimes that happens through policy, sometimes that happens through practice changes, through professional development, but we can't just say, stop doing it. We have to figure out ways to strategize and help the teachers who are in those classrooms so that there aren't kind of practices that are being used perhaps unintentionally, but that have damaging consequences. So first I want to start by just defining physical restraint. So the Colorado rules and regulations say that you can't use chemical or mechanical restraints in public schools. So I didn't consider the mechanical and chemical restraints in the work that I've been doing around restraint because they're not allowed in schools. Now, whether or not, and some of you who do advocacy work with schools probably know that that's not always the case, and mechanical restraints are kind of fuzzy. There are the stories of maybe school resource officers or police officers who come into schools and are using those plastic zip ties on some students. So, but what I'm focusing on is physical restraint, because even just looking at what happens with physical restraint, I think we could make enough of a difference around physical restraints that even if there are some non-inappropriate or not legal use of other kinds of restraints, some of the things we can learn about mitigating physical restraints can be used to mitigate some of those other kinds of restraints that perhaps might be being used even though they're not supposed to be. So the definition of physical restraint is by the Colorado Department of Education is the use of bodily physical force to involuntarily limit an individual's freedom of movement. And physical restraint of children, though it really can serve an emergency safety purpose. So throughout this, and I welcome disagreement on this, but I'm coming into this with the understanding that there are some situations where teachers feel unsafe and teachers feel their students in their classrooms are unsafe. So there may be a function for physical restraint to immediately stop dangerous behavior, but research shows and anecdotal evidence shows that restraint actually reinforces further aggression in students. And that also, and the Government Accountability Office report that I mentioned earlier also shows that it's really often being used in non-emergency situations. So even though, best practice is if there's an emergency, if there's a threat, if there's a physical safety issue, that's when physical restraint should be used if all other mechanisms have failed. That's not how it's being used. So the GAO report showed that not only is physical restraint being used in non-emergencies, but it's primarily being used in non-emergency situations for things like defiance, and defiance where there isn't any kind of sort of bodily harm threat. So the limited data that we have show that while there's the reported rate of emergency interventions, whether or not they're being used in emergencies or not. And so this actually includes seclusion, is in Colorado is about 26 per every 10,000 students. So that means out of every 10,000 students, so that's smaller than a typical district. Much smaller than a typical district, actually. And when you look at districts like Jefferson County or Denver, and they're much bigger than that. So the rate is, 26 out of every 10,000 students are being restrained or secluded. The data is really kind of flaky, I guess is the best way I can put it. If you ask, so Disability Law Center has been fabulous in really trying to get good data collection happening. They were behind some legislation this year that I'll talk about. But there's really no good mechanism for data collection in our state. So we don't really know that 26 out of every 10,000 is what the U.S. Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights said that we have from a 2014 study. The rate has ranged anywhere from 7 out of every 10,000 to 50 out of every 10,000. What we do know is that the rate's much higher for younger kids. So elementary school students are being restrained at almost double the rate of other age students. So the 5-year-olds, the 6-year-olds. So however, there's not just bad news, there's good news. So a lot of states actually are really now trying to respond to some of the concerns that have come up around the use of physical restraint in non-emergency situations and how to better prevent emergency situations from happening. So the mitigation of it as well as prevention. And really trying to get a better understanding of why restraint is used and prevent its use as much as possible. So in Colorado, this past legislative session, as Mary Jo mentioned, there was a bill that passed that now prohibits the use of prone restraint, which is the face down on the floor kinds of restraints in Colorado, which hadn't been, all types of physical restraints had been essentially accepted. There wasn't a limitation on the use of prone restraint. So that did pass. Unfortunately, what didn't pass in that bill was a better data collection process. And as I just mentioned, there are a lot of things we're not quite sure of around what's happening with physical restraint. So that's something I'll talk about as well. So in 2009, so here are some examples of some states that are, so Utah, we've got New Mexico, Connecticut, Kentucky, so a number of states. Ohio has done a lot of work around limiting the use of physical restraint. So a number of states really are trying to limit the use of physical restraint and put positive behavior supports and practices in place to better support students and teachers in classrooms so that they don't get to this sort of escalated incidents. In 2009, the Colorado Department of Education adopted rules for the administration of the Protection of Persons from Restraint Act, which was an act that was passed in 2000. But between 2000 and 2009, actually, there weren't Department of Education regulations around the use of physical restraint. So it wasn't until 2009 that they were put into place. And it says that restraint's only to be used in emergencies. But what we know is that that's not always how restraint is being used. So it's not just in emergency situations. So here are some of the issues we're facing. There's a lack of tools to understand, like, what are some best practices around preventing these things, these incidents from happening. There's really not sort of a systemic approach to assess use of physical restraint, to figure out sort of what are some of the antecedent things that are happening when restraint occurs in schools. There's not a good reporting system to figure out, okay, so let's take a look and let's track some patterns, or let's see whether, gosh, is it the same student multiple times? Is it 10 different students? There's not a really good sort of way to get sort of best and recommended practices into classrooms and into school districts so that people know how to best support students and prevent these kinds of things from happening. And as I mentioned, there are also like these big data problems. Like, we really don't know a lot. And that can be a big problem. I'll talk about data because everybody, I'm sure, wants to hear about data and analysis of data. And I'm kind of kidding because I know that that's always the thing people are like, what? But then we've got a lot of deficiencies. And I think it's really important, as much as we don't, it's not really sexy, we need to talk about the data and how we use it. And then disproportionality of restraint of students with IEPs. And that is, I think, a really important issue that we need to address. We've got So as I said, in Colorado, 26, we think maybe 26 out of every 10,000 students are being restrained. More than 75% of those are students with disabilities. So the majority of students who experience a physical restraint have a disability. Almost 50% of those who are restrained have an emotional disability. So they have the they're educationally categorized as having emotional disability. Unfortunately, we have no aggregate data so that districts aren't sort of reporting. And so I can't say, hey, Colorado Department of Education, what does our state look like? Like, what is it? How are kids with disabilities? You know, is there some disproportionality? So it's a district by district request that needs to be made, but they don't have to have aggregate information. So I could go to any district and ask them for this, but they could say no. They could say we don't have it, or they could say it's not something that we collect. So there's no aggregate reporting requirement. They do have to have a review of restraints every year. So that is a requirement in the rules and regulations for CDE, but that doesn't mean they have to have a written report that's available to the public that tells us how many kids are being restrained and how many of those kids have disabilities. So, so a really important factor, I think, so yes, we have data issues that need to be addressed. We need to have some recommended practices, but those things need to be in the context of understanding why kids with disabilities, particularly mental health issues, autism, and the categorization of emotional disability, are being restrained the most. What's perhaps not happening earlier on in those students' experiences that could help them and could prevent some of these more sort of escalated circumstances from happening. So our Colorado rates are a little bit higher than the national rates, but this is national data that comes from the U.S. Department of Education Office for Civil Rights. So nationally, this shows the enrollment data. So about 12% of students enrolled in public schools have disabilities, and that's defined as students who have IEPs. So there could be some unrecognized disabilities that make that percentage even higher. But students subjected to physical restraint is 75% of the population. Big difference. And so that's about the percentage, the disproportionality that we're seeing in Colorado, even though our rates are actually higher, if that makes sense. So the limited data that we do have in Colorado shows that, so if you want sort of a different way of thinking about this, the students with disabilities are restrained at a rate that's about 5 times higher than those, a little more than 5 times higher than those without disabilities. So that might be sort of a simpler way to think about it. So let me just go back. So we, as I mentioned, we do have, you know, some movement and some recognition that there are some issues that need to be addressed. The issue of prone restraint, that was a big one. You know, actually, almost every other kind of sort of institution or facility in Colorado has limitations on the types of restraints and the circumstances under which restraints can be used. Education was sort of the lone institution or type of environment where prone restraints still happen. So it was about time. But there's still, you know, interestingly, in education, there are fewer limitations on the use of physical restraint than there are in other kinds of facilities or institutions. So there has been some work done, like I said, in other states. And one of the things that did come out a few years ago was some of you may be familiar with it, and I can send a link out afterwards or post a link. So the U.S. Department of Education came out with a resource document to help prevent the use of restraint. And this resource document was really looked at as guidance because, like I said, there's no federal regulation around the use of restraint. It's really up to states and municipalities and districts to figure out how to manage the prevention and mitigation of the use of physical restraint. So the U.S. Department of Education came out with this resource document. So that's now what I consider sort of the gold standard of what we should be looking at to help reduce some of these practices. And in fact, there was just a study done a year or so ago analyzing state policies on and legislation on the use of restraint, and they used that resource document as sort of the litmus test against which they compared these policies. So it kind of is used as a kind of a gold standard document. So because of that, what I did is I took a look at that document as well as about 75 other documents, sort of both nationally and internationally, so literature, resources, policies, and tried to extract like what are some best practices? What are some recommended practices? Like we really don't have sort of this guidance other than the resource document, which still didn't get to the specificity of what kinds of information should we be collecting. So I took a sort of a deeper dive into this and looked at like what do we know about policies and practices, and developing some recommendations in some key areas around preventing restraint. So I'm not going to go through sort of all the literature, but I just want you to know that this isn't new work, but it's also not work that's had a lot of progress. Like I said, some states have been able to get sort of more limited use of restraint in place. There are some districts and municipalities that have actually banned the use of physical restraint. And we've got some data coming out of those districts now that's showing that they were actually successfully able to put some other kinds of practices in place so that they aren't having the sort of big urgent crises and needing to call the police, it's sort of a lot of things that were of concern, that those things aren't happening when they limited or restricted the use of physical restraint. So there is a lot of literature out there looking at sort of different things that we need to consider in restraint. So here's where, before I said, data's not very sexy, and I don't know if a lot of people really sort of think about data when they think about advocacy, but we need to. So the way I kind of like to think about it is if we have a really meaningful way of collecting data and using data and making informed decisions about it and changing practice because of what we're finding, I think we'll have a lot better success at getting people to understand, that includes policymakers, practitioners, teachers, families, to understand here are the kinds of things we can do. And here are the kinds of things that have successfully worked. If we don't have data to show that, we still don't know the number of physical restraints. If we don't have data to show, from this year to this year, we put these practices in place and the, restraints went down, or maybe they went up. We can't show that. We can't really tell a good story. So my framework is we need to have like a way of telling a good story. We need to be able to collect data, analyze it, use it, report on it, and then put that back into practice. So that, and a lot of times that may be like professional development. So there are a number of stakeholders who really, we need to think about as we think about who might be able to make a difference in these prevention strategies and using these recommended practices. Who are some of the people who are really, or the groups of people who are like the entities that we really need to work with to make a difference in collecting data, getting better practices in place. So we've got teachers, we've got school administrators, school district leadership, also like school boards who are sometimes making decisions around funding in school districts and whether mental health counselors are in place in school district and things like that. Policy and state agency leadership, parents and families, teacher training and professional development programs, and researchers. So those are all sort of entities and categories of people that we really need to consider as we're looking at what we can do about managing sort of this disproportionate use of physical restraint on kids with disabilities. Sometimes we don't think of some of those. I think sometimes we may not think about research as sort of a part of our advocacy strategy. So I'm not just saying, as I said before, we need to stop the practice. I'm also saying we need to better help support the people who are implementing the practices and making policies about these practices. We can't do things without supporting those teachers who are in those classrooms who are really struggling. So that's just a key ingredient in success of mitigating physical restraint practices. So there are a few focus areas that I think we need to think about. So we need some recommended practices on how we collect data, what kind of processes are in place. We need to make sure that there are adequate professional development programs, so training, and not just training on, so I know there have been organizations that have done good training on how to more safely do restraint, but that's not what I'm talking about. Those are, that's good to know. And we need more implementation of professional development and training that also shows here are some positive behavior supports, here's some social emotional learning strategies that we can put in place in classrooms and schools and districts so that kids have the tools they need, teachers have the tools they need to de-escalate and to sort of help identify challenges before they even happen. And then we need better reporting practices. Like we don't know what's going on if we don't know what's going on. We can't help fix what's going on if we don't know. So we really don't have good reporting practices now. So I'm going to quickly go through these because this is not like the meat of stuff. But if you're wondering sort of how I came up with recommended practices, these were vetted. These were based on where do we know nationally, internationally, what's going on? What are some other countries doing? So looked at a lot of literature, really went through sort of the best practices we know about and what some other states are doing who are really ahead of the curve. And went through a series of steps to really kind of vet a set of recommended practices, and then kind of tested them out in school districts. So I then went to 4. So I'm just going to skip through how I did that. But just so you know, I didn't kind of like pull these things out of a hat and say, this sounds good, or boy, I really want this to happen, so I'm going to put this one in the recommended practices. They really were based on a lot of literature that's out there. I mean, just keep in mind that I just spent the last 3 years doing a dissertation on this. And if any of you in here has done a dissertation. So if you've done a dissertation, you kind of know that if you don't look at all of the stuff that's out there, somebody's going to catch you on it. And somebody's going to ask you about it when you're defending your dissertation. So I was as thorough as I could be in looking at what do we know, what's out there, what do we know. So really did try to look at all of the literature, all of the resources, and capture sort of what can we, sort of synthesizing, okay, now how can we put that into practice? So I developed a set of recommendations too for what we can do to move forward as a state. So the recommended practices for mitigating the use of physical restraint. So here's kind of the meat of the stuff. And let me just pull out a couple of sort of details of this that I wanted to go through with you. So keep in mind that as I go through these recommended practices for what we as a state need to do, so if you want to do some advocacy, if you want to do some policy change around mitigating the use of physical restraint, particularly kids with disabilities, students with disabilities, and these younger children who are being restrained at twice the rate of older students, here are some of the things that can be sort of tools in your toolbox. And keep in mind that it's in the context of other things, sort of best practice things that we know should just generally be in place in schools, like schools having access to mental health professionals, schools having positive behavior supports in place, schools having social emotional learning curricula. So that's kind of the context in which these things should be happening. So we need to identify what data elements to collect. We need to know, is it the same student being restrained 10 times, or is it 10 students being restrained each one time? Some of those things we just still don't know, which makes a big difference. Documentation processes. How can schools, how can teachers, how can districts better document what's happening? Maybe there are patterns. Maybe at 2 o'clock in the afternoon in each classroom, something's happening that causes, one student to be restrained, that causes them to sort of some behaviors that are just not able to be under control by either the student or the teacher. So looking for sort of patterns. So if we're not documenting these things, we don't know how to look for patterns. Better parent notification processes. We need to ensure that not only are parents notified if a restraint happens, but building relationship with parents if there are challenges sort of that teachers might think might become more problematic, building relationships with parents so that the first contact with a parent or a guardian isn't when a crisis occurs. It's helping to develop an IEP that's much more meaningful and really addresses some of the issues that can prevent behavior, that the need for more intense behavioral interventions. Reporting requirements. As I said, none of us in this room could ask the state what's happening with restraint in our our school districts, or, you know, boy, how does Adams County compare to El Paso County? We don't know. You know, unless disability law, Colorado does, you know, either has a complaint or does one of their periodic studies on what's happening in our state, we don't have that information publicly available. The reviewing of incidents, like I said, if we don't look at how things are happening, when incidents are happening, what are the antecedents to things happening, there's no way that we can then impact the future use of those practices. Like, we need to review this stuff. We need to look at what's going on. Staff training. You know, we can't just say, as I keep saying, I know I've reiterated this now probably 3 times, we can't do this if we don't have alternatives and if teachers aren't feeling comfortable with the tools that they have to prevent sort of challenging behaviors and interventions that they feel are sort of their only option when it gets to that sort of escalation point. And then use of data. We gotta look at how, you know, if Susie is being restrained and if 10 times in the past 6 months she was restrained, let's look at that pattern. You know, schools need to be looking at it, but we need to have ways of ensuring that there's some accountability for using, you know, we can't just say collect data and then not use it. So we need to have ways of really looking at it. So that's another push that we all, I think, need to make with schools and districts, is to help them understand how to better use the data that they are collecting. So when I did look at districts, and I know I got to wrap up, so when I did look at some districts, so I looked at 4 school districts in Colorado, and so there are some areas where districts actually really have policies that are meaningful. So if you look at sort of documentation processes, so 92% of these 4 districts that I looked at have policies that identify what needs to be documented, or how documentation needs to happen. So that is happening in about 92% of these 4 districts I looked at. And so I looked at urban and rural. So granted, 4 districts is not, you know, it was a sampling of urban, rural, and districts that had identified low or no use of restraints, and districts that had identified sort of higher use of restraints. But if you look at areas like use of data for students, it's 19%. So what that means is that only 19% of district and school policy, I looked at 4 school policies as well, only 19% of them actually identify in their policies that we need to make meaningful use of this data for students. So I did come up with some policy and practice changes. So I'm not going to read through all of these, but essentially there are some things that we can do. And you remember those sort of 9 categories that I came up with around what do we need to move forward? How do we need to do things a little bit differently? So data elements, documentation processes, parent notification, etc. So I came up with some specific things in each of those categories, and you have access to these slides on the information for the webinar. So I would suggest, I don't want to go through these now, but going through these and maybe looking at some of the specific recommendation in each of these 9 areas, because it might be a helpful tool for you as a parent, for you as a professional, for you as a policymaker, for you as an advocate, for you as a researcher, for all of those different stakeholder areas, wherever you might fit in. Some of these policy or practice recommendations could help in your work moving forward to help these students who are being physically restrained. So just a few implications that sort of to think about as we move forward in this work: better data collection, more meaningful use of data and documentation, trying to mitigate the use of these practices. You know, all the data collection in the world isn't helpful if the practices continue. More specific information on the disproportionality of age groups. So as I said, we think 50% there's a 50% higher rate of elementary school students, but we're not quite sure because we don't have really good data. Specifying prevention strategies and policies to help prevent these things, and using recommended practices. What I'm hoping is that the set of recommended practices that I've come up with that I've vetted, that are based on national, international literature, that those can help districts, those can help teachers, those can help advocates, those can help policymakers, and that we can use those to get better things in place for our students. And so there's still some work to be done, but I want to end with just a really short story about the two girls that you see here. So the girl on the left is my daughter, that's Molly, and she has an autoimmune disease. She's got juvenile diabetes, type 1 diabetes. And the day after her diagnosis, I was meeting with the school nurse, and she had a 504 plan developed. It was instant. No crisis developed, recognized the symptoms right away. She didn't have to go into crisis before anybody did anything about it. And I also want you to meet my niece, Eve, who's on the right, who has mental illness. And she was restrained in some months. I think there were up to about 15 or 20 restraints a month, physical restraints per month, because her behaviors were just out of control. She was, biting teachers and throwing chairs at other students and running away. And so for Eve on the right here, it took about 2.5 years for her to get an IEP because it wasn't interfering. She was also gifted and talented, and it wasn't interfering with her academics. So even though she was hurting people and hurting herself, and it was extremely disruptive, she's still really smart. And so she didn't get an IEP until 2.5 years after all of this, after countless restraints. So I just wanted to show the difference between my daughter and her physical health issues and the immediacy of her getting the supports that she needed before it turned into crisis, and my niece, who had to wait 2.5 years and had to be restrained, 2.5 years worth of restraints before and had to escalate to a crisis before she got the supports that she needed. What I hope folks can do with this is help to move these things forward, to take some of these recommended practices and figure out what kinds of things make sense to you, and help reduce the use of these practices, and particularly help reduce the use of these practices in this disproportionate way with kids with disabilities. That's all I got. So thank you.
I'll speak up. I'll come back to. Okay. So I'll just reiterate what you've already said from my own son's experience. I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir at this point. Most of you know me and my son. Those who don't, you'll soon find out. Like you say, after 4 years of abuse, never documented, not once. And then even moving back into public school, he was restrained, secluded, and suspended, and none of that was documented. It took 5 months of repeated requests of the school district to even document that it even happened. And I'll call it out. We live in Jefferson County, so you figure we're one of the largest counties, and our school didn't even document that he was secluded, restrained, and suspended. And it took 5 months of me pushing and pushing and pushing for them to document, and they finally put it in the system. So I guess I'll reiterate that yes, I agree that the system is still sorely lacking, even if we have steps in place that are mandatory requirements for reporting. I would argue that for me personally and my family, it still is not occurring. Your information.
There it is.
Hello.
Hello.
It's Val. I really appreciate your information. Thank you, Sarah. All the while, I'm wondering, in your data, were you including, when you say records from school districts and such, does that exclude treatment centers and places where kids go? It does exclude that.
Yep, this was
because I would think the rates would be so much higher if you did include that.
This was just the public schools that are, well, I shouldn't say that. They're public schools and schools that have the public school funding. So there were some schools. So it wasn't like treatment centers, but it was public schools. So it could have been. I think there were some charter school. There were some charter schools in there. And
in the second question is of the states you looked at, is California a no restraint state? And did you kind of look at what that looked like, and what do states that are no restraint states do?
I don't think California is a no restraint state. I thought there were municipalities in California who have passed regulations.
I just know someone came to our house and said, oh, you're not a no restraint place. And I said, well, I didn't even know that existed. So. Hi. Sorry. Lori Sharon from Pueblo. My question is, did you look at any information related to the suspension and expulsion? I provide autism services through early intervention as well as for children 6 months to 8 years, Colorado region, pretty much from Pueblo to New Mexico and to Kansas. And I get a lot of phone calls from parents who said, I picked my daughter or I picked my son up from preschool today, and they told me they were expelled and they can't come back, and they have an IEP. I've only lived in Colorado for a couple of years, but I didn't really know what to say to that because I've worked professionally for over 30 years in 2 other states and have never heard that before.
So
I didn't know if it's something you looked at or other people are looking at.
Yes, I guess, and yes. What I've been talking about now is just focused on physical restraint, but about 6 or 7 years worth of my work before this was around preschool expulsions and looking at sort of the disproportionality, particularly of kids. So kids with disabilities are suspended at about 3 times the rate of other kids, and particularly little kids. Yeah. So as Mary Jo said, there was some legislation proposed this session that didn't pass to try and limit those kinds of practices on discipline practices on young children. But yes, so I've looked at suspensions and expulsions, and particularly expulsions, and there are 2 different systems. So there's the public school system, there's the K-12 system, which sometimes includes preschools, but not all public school has a preschool. And then there's the early care and education system. And there are 2 different sets of rules around suspensions and expulsions for those 2 systems. So in the public school system, those have to be reported. In the early care and education system, they do not. So we don't really know, and the state has been working, and the Office of Early Childhood, working with the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment and some other folks, have been looking at ways to more consistently be able to track those things. But right now, we don't have a mechanism for the birth through 4-year-olds. We don't have a mechanism to track how many of them are being suspended or expelled, because it could be just one day you show up. I mean, with my son, I would get calls twice a week saying, it's 1 o'clock in the afternoon. I know you weren't going to come till 5 to pick him up, but can you come get him now? So it's like sort of the soft suspensions. Do we have time to keep going? Yeah, okay. This is great. There are so many questions. I mean, I think it's great to see all this interest in this, because hopefully we can all make a difference.
Yeah, I was concerned when you pointed out the percentage of people using data was really low. And
those are percentage of policies that say you need to use data. So that's not necessary. We don't know who's actually using it. Those are policies that say we need to use the data.
Okay. Yeah. Because I've just seen, I mean, you create data or you create research and people know best practice, but it doesn't ever hit the streets, or we don't have the pre-post, which is absolutely critical to determine what a best practice is. So until you're not going to get those stats that do a comparative of, and granted, it's difficult, it's complicated, there's more that's just not black and white, but it just seems really as critical to look at data and the next step, how are people actually using that? And then okay, then we can finally figure out, all right, if they're actually using it and they, you know, kind of a practice versus this, you have somewhere to go. And then that can dictate policy. But right now, it just seems like we know some real basics around how to treat children, but we also know that isn't how children are treated. So like how can we figure out to make the reality a piece of legislation actually hit the life of a kid?
And right now we don't really know. I mean, unless anecdotally we talk to schools and districts and say, what are you doing with this data? We don't know because only 19% of the policies, and granted that was just the districts and schools I looked at, actually have policies that say after a restraint, you need to take that and have a review meeting and then, sort of what the next steps are after that. So their policies don't say it. They may be doing it. We don't know.
Well, and the other point I wanted to make in case people are interested that you alluded to is disability law does have a special right to go in and look at investigations and get the data that families can't, or somebody who wants to be kind of a consumer reports project, but disability law can do that, which I think is good. But then again, I was very disappointed in the legislation in that the data is not going to go to the Department of Ed. And I always kind of viewed the Department of Ed as the technical assistance, so that if they could track data and say, oh, this district over here has really high rates, we have limited resources, we should put our resources toward here for technical assistance, but CDE is not going to know. So it seemed kind of odd that schools were not, and I maybe naively looked at that as data would lead to technical assistance, and that does. But clearly the local school districts aren't looking at that data as a resource. I assume they're looking at it as a threat for a lawsuit. I don't know why they wouldn't want to share data. But anyway, that's another concern.
And I do need to finish now, but just one more thing on that is just that I'm not blaming, I don't think CDE is saying, no, we're not going to do it. They just don't have the human capacity at their offices to review and collect the data. So it would take adding capacity, adding human resources to CDE to be able to do this.
I just add to that, that's perfect. My comment was, I think if you reported the data and requested that technical assistance, you'd have to address the fact that there's no mental health or consistency in training statewide around intervention for those students. So I think if you don't see the data, then you don't have to deal with the fact that we don't have capacity.
Keep the blinders on. Right.
Thanks so much, Sarah. Okay. Okay, we're not going to do break now. We're going to do the one last piece that we had scheduled before the break. Louisa Wren from Rocky Mountain Health Plan is going to give us an update on the crisis pilot. For those who maybe aren't familiar, the crisis pilot was authorized and began work last August, and they're approaching filing of a year's report on what has happened with it. So what Louisa was able to get authorization from the department to tell us specifically is a little bit limited today, but we'll have more information at the next CANDO meeting. So Louisa.
Thank you, Corey. Yeah, I'm official now. I'm allowed to talk. Good morning. How many of you were here for the March presentation? Okay. So as Corey talked about, oh good, I know how to work this. The cross-system crisis response pilot program officially kicked off in March of 2016 we began seeing patients in August of 2016. So we're about 8-9 months into the program. There's 2 regions where we're piloting this program, and the goal of the program is to improve how communities respond to dual diagnosis individuals, so individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities with an underlying mental health / behavioral health diagnosis who are in crisis, and how communities, so the CCBs, the community-centered boards, are working with the mental health centers on responding to these crises. The response can take place in different ways. It could be, there's in both communities, so one of the communities is Larimer County, the other one is on the western slope. It includes Grand Junction, so Mesa County, Montrose, Delta, Garfield, which is Glenwood Springs, Rifle, which is also Garfield County. So it's the mental health centers and the CCBs in those areas that are part of this pilot. Rocky Mountain Health Plans is the health plan that applied for and was granted the management of the pilot. So my job is to support those community providers in working with, supporting them in what they need to do to set up the systems to support these individuals in crisis, and to be a liaison between those partners and HICPUF and the department. As Corey said, there's a lot of information that we've been collecting. I've sent all of it to the department. They're giving their legislative update, their legislative report on July 1st. Once they give that, I will be able to come back here. I thought, oh, you fixed it. Yay, Corey. I had October on there. Obviously, I can't count. So at the September CANDO meeting, I'll be able to give a lot more data and stats on individuals, numbers of individuals, and outcomes and that kind of data. Right now, the department needs to give this legislative report first before I can submit it to the public. So I will have that in September. But I do have some information. And actually this says Grand Junction, but it's actually all pilot individuals. This includes Larimer County as well. So as of May, approximately 137 people have received crisis support services through the pilot, 80 adults and 57 children. This is about 3 times more than we expected to come through the pilot. So I consider that actually a really good thing. It's certainly stretching our resources, because the way the pilot was funded was assuming about a third of this many individuals. But I think it's great because, one, it means that people in the community know the crisis pilot exists and are accessing it. I can talk, actually before I talk about diagnoses. So I can talk a little bit, a couple of things that have occurred since I was here in March is I had to put together about 14 reports to send to the department on what's happened, processes that we're using as far as, procedures, those kinds of things, how we're trying to work with customized by community, and how the CCBs and the mental health centers work with their communities and make sure that these approaches are regional with an underlying use of best practices nationally, using the START model, which is a model out of the University of New Hampshire that is, they've got a lot of data and best practices on how to manage crisis in folks with dual diagnosis. So we're using START model tools, and it's made a lot of improvement in the way that both of these communities are assessing and managing crises. In addition to that, so since I was here in March, I've been able to go through 2 different audits where the state or the department has hired an outside, hired TriWest as an outside entity to come in and do site visits in both locations. We have interviewed both the people and their families who have received services and gone through the crisis services. And that's been great for me because it's really nice to be able to actually sit down and kind of see the before and after of what would have happened before and how was it handled this time? What does the follow-up care look like? So I can answer questions about that as well. As far as diagnoses, as far as the individuals coming through the pilot, we've seen people with, autism, psychotic disorders, mood disorders, conduct disorders. Quite a few people have had 3 or 4 diagnoses and symptoms that are coming through the pilot. And then further diagnosis breakdown. So there's quite a few. I'm sure none of these are surprising to anybody, related to folks with IDD and then also having, some of these other behavioral health issues. So this is just a list of, the 137 people that have come through the different diagnoses they have. As far as the funding, one of the things that we found is that I think that we had an expectation that a lot of the people coming through the pilot would be on Medicaid, and we were surprised how many aren't. So this pilot is not Medicaid specific. If you have commercial insurance, if you have no insurance, if you're undocumented, whoever is in crisis, the pilot will care for, Medicare, Medicaid. What we are doing in order to stretch the pilot dollars as far as we can, we're making sure that when folks come in, if they have not been identified or found eligible previously for Medicaid, the CCBs are working very closely with them and their families to fill out the paperwork and see if they can get them on Medicaid so they can receive as many services as possible. So we are, in addition to the pilot dollars, we are billing Medicaid on the waivers for anything that they qualify for so that those services can be paid for through Medicaid, and just to support these people and their families so that, as in the future, they can have access to more and more services that are paid for. And then some of the individuals, especially the kids, receive family support services through DHS. So again, we're trying to just maximize the amount of services that are available to these families so that they're supported. Affects the pilot, yes. Both. But yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. So the question was, am I saying that they're eligible for money because of the crisis or because of their diagnoses or financial reasons? And the answer is both. So we're obviously identifying some of these folks as they come in through the crisis. And so we're kind of looking at the entire smorgasbord of what's available to them, whether it's through DHS or Medicaid, and just saying, what do they qualify for? So it could be for financial reasons, but in many cases, it's that they qualify for an HCBS waiver. So we're connecting individuals with the Medicaid services, like I just discussed. We've got 3 times more individuals than we expected. And we've really improved crisis management for these individuals. One of the examples up in Larimer County, they're working very closely with both the Fort Collins Police Department and the Loveland Police Department on crisis response for people with dual diagnoses. These mobile support teams that are comprised of, so what happens many times, there's different ways that people can come in through the pilot. They can come in, one of the most common way is they walk into the crisis center. That's a regional crisis center. There's one up in Fort Collins. There's one, the one in Mine Springs in Mesa County and Grand Junction. So it's usually a family's in crisis and they walk in. So there's 3 questions that the person at the mental health center is using to assess whether or not that patient may actually have an intellectual or developmental disability. If they answer those questions in a manner that makes the assessor believe they may have an IDD, then they immediately call in Mason County Strive or Foothills Gateway up in Fort Collins. So someone from the CCB to come out, and they do a dual assessment. And it's not just not a dual assessment, a dual management of the crises. So it's using the expertise of the people at the CCBs to help manage the crisis, because they understand the IDD. They understand that this person with this diagnosis in crisis is going to have these specific needs that are different than just someone else in a behavioral health crisis. I got a lot of questions last time I was here about the scope of the pilot. It is a limited pilot as far as right now. It is in just those 2 regions. A lot of people asked questions last time about the prison population and whether or not this pilot applies to those that are justice-involved individuals. Right now, that is not part of the pilot, because the prison population has their own support system. I believe they use the CIT training to manage folks that are justice involved individuals. And then it's limited to these counties. So one of the things I am able to present to you that I wanted to do quickly was show you one of the homes. So what we've done in Grand Junction is there's 2 homes. One's for adult, one's for children. There are 2 homes in Larimer County as well. But what I'm going to do is show you today the photographs of, these are therapeutic support homes. So when individuals have been in, there's a couple options for when people go to these homes. They can either be in an ER, and we've had someone go out and help manage their crisis. They can be discharged from an emergency room to this home. They can be discharged from an inpatient mental health facility to this home. They can, if the mobile crisis support team goes out and meets the family in their home because there's a crisis going on, they could come from their host home or their family's home to this therapeutic support home. So they've gone in, Strive has gone in and modified these homes so that they're very safe. This particular house on Elm Street is equipped to handle someone who's, it can handle people who are having violent tendencies, who have suicidal ideation. There's actually a lot they can manage at this particular home. The level of acuity of patients they can manage here is much higher than the homes in Larimer County. It's just the way they set up their pilots. So I was just going to go through and show you some of the modifications. They got a lot of feedback from the START program in New Hampshire on what to do to make these homes safe for the individuals that are staying there. The individuals that stay there, there's someone that was there for 4 months. So, because that's what he needed. There's some people that are there for 4 days. We're not technically through the pilot doing quote unquote respite. But in many cases that does kind of end up being some of what these homes are for, but it's not just, for lack of a better word, a holding place for somebody while the patients are here. These individuals are getting supports, behavioral modification. Many of the patients I've talked to, they hate the word coping skills. They absolutely detest that word. So we were calling them life skills. So they're getting life skills for, okay, when you're angry, what can you do? Here's your list of options that are, healthy choices versus not healthy. So they're learning that. And during that time, Strive is also supporting the family or the host home to say, okay, here's what you can do when your loved one does this instead of this, because this is a trigger for them. So we're supporting both the family and the individual in learning skills to hopefully, we understand that avoidance of crisis for these individuals, complete avoidance is probably not going to happen. It's just the nature of the dual diagnosis. But reduction in frequency of crisis and lessening the intensity of the crisis, that's the goal. And to help the families and the community not go into crisis when the individual does. So these homes, so this is the home, it's right across the street. You can kind of see in that, I think in this picture, it's right across the street from a park. A lot of the individuals end up, part of their daily routine is just to literally walk the perimeter of the park. This is the house. So what they've, so it really looks like someone's home. They've done a really good job of making it look very homey. One of the things they've done, I'll go back to this one, is there is nothing, all the coffee tables are all bolted to the floor. There is nothing small that can be thrown that isn't a pillow, or this is a, that's a basket, and they usually put, I think, just silk flowers in them. So if you throw those, it's not going to hurt anybody. And all of the artwork is bolted to the wall, so you can't pull it off. So as far as getting angry and grabbing and throwing something, that's not, there's not a safety concern there. In the rooms, all of the, there's 4 bedrooms. There are no closet doors. There's just open cubbies with colorful bins for people to put their clothes. All of the curtains are Velcro rip away, so there's no cords, no ligature related things in there. Just there's all over the room. There's just it's not. This is one of them. This Jimmy Buffett quote of "breathe in, breathe out, move on." Those things are like in every big room. They're painted on the wall. Just these really calming things that are really nice. I think they've done a great job. The toilets have tank lids, which are bolted down for security. Every handrail has a solid center. So if you look at the handrail, you can't put your hand through it. So you can't really see that in the photo, but there's no, it's solid on the other side. All the showers are equipped with ligature preventative heads and controls. These are really expensive, and they ordered these and had them all installed. All the bathroom sinks are equipped with ligature preventive faucets and plumbing covers. The bathroom mirrors are polished metal, they're not glass. The interior doors are equipped with ligature preventative door knobs and locks. Nothing can hang off of them. Oh, this is really cool. The interior doors are equipped with door hinges that allow doors to open either way. So they're like dual hinges. So nobody can lock themselves in the room because you can always open it from the other side. And you can't hang anything off of it either. The electrical outlets are custom made to prevent insertion of any objects. All the lighting in the ceiling is recessed and made of non-glass material, including the bulbs. This dining room table, we actually had to make this modification. There were benches before that could move, and somebody picked one up and threw one, so now they're bolted to the ground, including the table. This is what we talked about earlier, designing the closets. Picture below has worked best, and the bed frames are also bolted to the flooring. All the windows, including the bathroom and doors, are Lexington safety glass. And then where necessarily blinds are inside the window panes, but where we don't have blinds, we had those rip away Velcro curtains. So I just wanted everybody to see what we've done to modify the homes. It's similar to the modifications they have in the inpatient crisis centers throughout the state. But we've done that for these homes. So the Strive home this Strive home in Grand Junction, like I said, they can take really, really high acuity patients. If it's someone that has suicidal ideation or is violent, they do 2-to-1 staffing. Someone there is there 24 hours a day. But one example I will share with you that is a young man who had been living in Montrose and ended up staying, went into crisis, ended up left or was admitted to St. Mary's in Grand Junction for inpatient psych. And when he was discharged, he came to this home for 4 months. I got the privilege of meeting with him and talking with him a lot. And he really talks about, he just calls it 181. And he just talks about how great it was. He had a lot of violent tendencies. He is now, after being there 4 months, living in a home with 2 other gentlemen. He is still receiving services from Strive, and he's working part-time, and he is doing great. So it was really a huge benefit to him and his family that he was able to come here and get stabilized and then continue follow-up services so that he is far more independent than he was before and in a much healthier environment now. So any questions? I know we don't have a lot of time. Just going to bring you the mic.
Are there both males and females in each of the houses?
Okay, so each community has 2 homes. They do not mix males and females. And so, for example, I would say in general, we've been incredibly flexible and constantly shifting in the pilot from the standpoint of, so if there's no kids in the kids' home, and there's, say, a male adult in 181, they'll take, if a female needs to use a home and there's no kids, they'll bring her to the kids' home. But the other thing with the kids' home is it's a duplex. So it's separate, there's separation. So they could put an adult in one side and have a child in the other. So we've just been really, really flexible with what are the needs. And so yeah, we do keep the genders separate.
Thank you. This was really helpful. This is Carol Meredith. I'm really looking forward to the report. Is that going to be like July 2nd at the JBC? July 3rd?
I can check. And what I have done is
July 1st is a Saturday.
Right. And so I'm not sure, you get the good point. So I'm not sure when they're going to, but I will check with the department and I'll let you know. As soon as I have it, I'm happy to share it with Corey and she can send it out.
It'd be great.
The other thing, part of the annual reporting, Carol, was identification of best practices so far and gaps in services. That's the other thing, is through the pilot, what have we identified as, wow, this is hugely missing? One, I would say in Larimer County, is inpatient psych for children. There are little to no options. So most of those patients that if they come through the ER at Poudre Valley or are walking to the crisis center at Summit Stone and they need that higher level of care, they're being sent down to Jefferson Hills in Denver. And that's really far. And Jefferson Hills is a great facility, but it's in Denver. So there's that. The other thing is a great need for families with children under the age of 18 that really need respite. And and one of our recommendations is planned respite. Now, what a concept.
Thank you.
What a concept. So the idea of the family knows that once a month, their child can go here, and it's not a holding cell. It's not to sit and watch videos all day. It's to learn, to get behavioral support and to learn different ways of, I'm not going to use what's coping, life skills. And then while they're there, the family's also getting support for, making sure that the crises don't elevate maybe they're going to occur, but they don't elevate to the point of someone calling the police or having to run to the crisis center. So so that's one part of the report that I've given to the department is here are the gaps that we've identified in the system.
I know you probably haven't had time to get to this yet with the pilots, but it wasn't just about crisis intervention. It was about prevention, right?
Right. And we are there, and I'll tell you why, because, well, let's put it this way. So once the family can, well, it's a couple things. One, we're letting the communities know that these services are available. So once it's not a matter of, and that's one of the challenges we've had. When does the crisis end? So and many of these individuals have come through multiple times. They've been in the homes 3 and 4 times. The good news is the intensity of their crises has been lower each time. So that's progress. But it's the follow-up care, which is what do we need to put in place with managing between the behavioral support services through the mental health centers and the support services through the CCBs to, like I said, I don't know if we can completely prevent future crises, but it's a goal, but to reduce frequency and intensity, what can we do to support the families so it doesn't get to that point? And so that is something we're doing in the pilot. And that's where we're working on prevention. Anyone else? Oh, this gentleman. Okay. Uh-huh. Okay.
A lot of outreach.
I don't have a ton of specifics on it, but I can connect you with Erin Eulenfeld at Foothills because she's the one that's been setting up those programs. I know that the Loveland Police Department one is farther along and more, doing more work right now than the Fort Collins Police Department. But I would have to get you more specifics on exactly what they're doing. So do you know Erin?
I know Erin well.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Okay, so she would probably be able to give you more specifics on exactly what they're doing. The other piece of the training with the community is, so right now, the reason we haven't gone farther in that yet is we have a group of about, I think, 15 people, both in the pilot, both between Western Slope and Larimer County, who are currently going through professional learning community certification through the START program, the University of New Hampshire program. They will all graduate and be trained by the end of July. They will then, it's a train the trainer program. So they are then trained to go out both within their agencies and the community, whether it's schools, ER staff is the other one we want to work with, and then first responders to then train them. So that's the idea, is that's the next phase for next year, is to go out into the community and train more people on what to do when you have someone with a dual diagnosis in crisis.
Thanks so much.
Sure.
Louisa.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Okay, we'll take a break until 10 after, so not quite 10 minutes. Sorry to shorten it, but we've got much left to do. And we'll definitely follow up on the report. There were also a number of questions from last session, last CANDO meeting, Louisa's presentation, that we'll try and get more information on.
Just my take on what's going down with all of this. So let's do a short history. Many of you probably know Betty Lehman, but I was talking to her the other day, and we figured out that we've been advocating for behavioral services for children with autism and other kids in healthcare policy and financing since 1994. So it's a long time coming. And in 2002, we finally passed the Children with Autism waiver, but it was vetoed by the governor. It was the most depressing day of my life. It was about this time of the year, and I remember I tore out all sorts of stuff in my house because I was so angry. And then in 2004, we came back and got the Children with Autism waiver passed again by the legislature, and the governor actually signed it. Took a long time to get it implemented, but we finally did for the 75 kids that were on that waiver. In 2009, HIMAT was passed, the Health Insurance Mandate for Autism Treatment, which is a commercial insurance plan mandate in the state of Colorado. It doesn't cover ERISA plans. It only covers commercial insurance plans that are regulated by the state of Colorado, but that was, we got something happening there. Then we did tweaks to the Children with Autism waiver over the years. And then finally in 2015, we decided that we'd expand the Children with Autism waiver through the legislature. But about, a third of the way through the legislative process, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid put out a directive saying, this needs to be covered through Medicaid for all children for whom it is medically necessary. So that's for you young ones who don't know what happened all those years. So it's now covered through EPSDT, early periodic screening, diagnostic, and treatment. It's not exactly an exception. It's like medically necessary kind of stuff, but it has to go through the EPSD process to get behavioral therapies covered. And if you click on their website that's in the PowerPoint, everything is on the HCPF website, from the providers that are listed, the definition is on there. And the great thing about this is it's not just for children with autism. Like the Children with Autism waiver, you had to have a diagnosis of autism. This is for all kids for which behavioral services are medically necessary. So I really encourage you to go to that website and click around in there and find out how this thing works and should be working. So what does this mean for the waivers? These are interconnected. Waiver services cannot duplicate services available through the state plan or EPSDT under Medicaid. So as y'all know, this was kind of really murky in Colorado for a long time. I mean, we had waivers paying for speech therapy and physical therapy and all sorts of stuff until we finally started to really follow the rules and know that you can't do that. If you're in like one of the adult waivers and you need speech therapy, that does not come out of the waiver. That comes out of state plan Medicaid. And so with behavioral services now being available through state plan EPSDT, for children who are currently enrolled in one of the other waivers that I've listed here, and these offer behavioral services, right? So eventually, these behavioral services cannot be provided through the waivers. They have to be provided through Medicaid for children up to the age of 21, because EPSDT doesn't care about adults, doesn't matter for adults. It's not a federal protection for adults. Okay, so behavioral services will be removed from the children's waiver. They're not removed now, right? The Children with Autism waiver is still operating. The CES waiver is still operating. You can still get behavioral services under SLS if you want to. But they have to eventually be removed. And we're not doing this behind CMS's back. They know that we're trying to get this all figured out. So the Children with Autism waiver will go away. because the only services we offered under the Children with Autism waiver were behavioral services. So that whole waiver is going to go away. And so we met not too long ago. It was a pretty diverse stakeholder group, and talked about, well, what's the best way to do this? And everyone pretty much agreed that let's stop the wait list, first of all. Why go on the wait list for something that you can get through the state plan? Then we'll stop enrollments, so that's people who are on the wait list and are going to get enrolled. And then the services will stop. We've got a tentative timeline. I didn't want to put that out there because I couldn't find it in my notes, and because, you know, that may change here and there as we move ahead, but that's the plan. And then after that we do this for the Children with Autism waiver, that's going to happen in the Children's Extensive Support Waiver, CES, and CHIRP, the Children's Habilitative Residential Program. Now, we're not going to remove behavioral services from SLS, Supported Living Services, or the HCBS-DD waiver, the residential comp waiver, because we still need those behavioral services to be available to people who are over the age of 21, right? So we're not going to take those away from those waivers. But there, you know, it's a big, long process. It's a public process, which we all have to be grateful for. The public processes take a long time. And so there's going to, you know, rules will have to change, and then the draft of those rules will go out to everybody, and everybody will comment, and then Medical Services Board will say, you know, yeah, this looks pretty good. Let's study this for a month or two, and then come back and somebody will finally vote on these kinds of things. So it's not going to happen like tomorrow, but it is going to happen, and I wanted you all to know about that. So, what are the unintended consequences? They're always there. And one of the unintended consequences is families that are over income for Medicaid or the buy-in, the Medicaid buy-in, people who cannot access Medicaid unless they're eligible for CES or Children with Life-Limiting Illness waiver or one of the other children's waivers. They're going to have to rely on the health insurance mandate for autism treatment in their commercial plan, because they're not going to be able to get those behavioral services if they're over income through Medicaid unless they're eligible for another waiver. Now, Dennis and a whole bunch of us are working really hard to try to expand that, but and we've done a lot of analysis on that to try to get some of these kids into the Children's Home and Community-Based Services waiver, but it has like a $9 million price tag, our best guess. And getting $9 million for the legislature at the moment is pretty tough go. HIMAT will be less affordable as families have to pay copays and deductibles. So previously, if they were on the Children with Autism waiver and were using HIMAT, they didn't have to pay those deductibles and copays because if you have Medicaid, providers can't charge for those higher rates, right? So that's going to be less affordable for families in the long run, and we need to just know that. And those are the people that are higher income, they're over income for Medicaid. And greater coordination of benefits between HIMAT and EPSDT. So if you're dually eligible, you have commercial insurance plan that covers behavioral services, and you're also eligible for Medicaid for whatever reason, we want to make it so that families aren't falling off the you know, I only take commercial insurance, HIMAT kind of the provider, and then as soon as you're done, maxed out your commercial plan, you have to go someplace else. That's not good for kids. That's not good for families. That's not a good way to go. Oh, this is where I was talking about the Dennis thing. So we do have Dennis Roy runs that waiver, the children's HBS waiver, and he's here. So this is that bullet point is the plan to change the level of care on the children's CBS waiver to include the ICF IDD level of care. We'd love to do that. We just got to find the money and the political will to do that. So action items, advocate for ICF IDD level of care in children's HCBS. If we can do that, if we can get that $9 million passed through the legislature, that'd be a great thing. Then those unintended consequences would go away for those kids and families who are over income for Medicaid. Encourage providers to become EPSDT providers because the other behavioral services are going to go away. They're going to go away. It's not an easy process to become like approved to be an EPSDT provider. So you need to get on it with your providers and the providers in the room. Just, let's get going. It needs to happen. This is one of the things that I'm encouraging people to do. And this is really just sort of a Carol Meredith thing. But I think now that we have behavioral services under EPSDT and we have personal care services for children under state plan Medicaid, we need to encourage families to use those two services because that in itself can help avoid burnout. What we see over and over at the ARC is these pubescent children who don't want their parents telling them to go brush their teeth or comb their hair or take a shower or, eat their lunch or which is completely normal for adolescents to be pulling away from that. If you can get a personal care provider in there who's doing that direction, you're going to reduce the stress on the family and hopefully you're going to be teaching the young person how to start dealing with personal care providers and how to learn to be competent dealing with those personal care providers. So early and often, we really want to increase skill building in the children and their family units, as well as reduce that caregiver burnout. And then fight like hell to keep adequate federal participation in Medicaid. I mean, if you haven't called today, you need to make that call. If you haven't emailed today, you need to make that email today because it is coming and it's coming fast and furious and it's not a very public process. And if they cut Medicaid a lot, I know Mary Jo already talked to you about this, but if they do, it's going to make all of what we're trying to do here that much harder or next to impossible. That's all I've got.
Thanks.
Oh.
Perfect. All right, good afternoon, everyone. Are we awake? This is always my fear, being next to last, that everyone's either asleep or bailed, and so y'all are either not listening or gone. So hopefully you're paying attention, and the folks on the webinar as well are paying attention. I too, like Carol, I represent no one but me. So my PowerPoints are probably some fact and some opinion. No, my documents are always fact, but I'll throw in some opinion. And I'll let you know when that happens, though, so that there's no confusion about what the department advocates for and what Shannon is advocating for. So what I'm going to talk about is the ULTC 100.2. And I think we all decided at the beginning of the meetings when we talked about this, we don't want to call it that anymore. We wanted to call it like 100.3 something.
we don't want to call it that. So just know that that'll be the first thing. We also want to get away from using the word tool. And also, this is just the children's portion. I did not work on the adult tool portion, which Carol did. And if you have questions, we can certainly have her address those. But so I did just work on the children's portion of this process. So just to give a little bit of history, I know, again, we all have our experts in the room and all understand the process, but for those who don't understand why we wanted a new tool, through healthcare policy and financing, the community center boards, the single entry points, we just found that over 30 different tools were being used to assess eligibility for those with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And it's all being used to collect data, which we all know is great. But when you have that much kind of scattered data, and it's not probably really great data. Also, some of the core tools were being used, but some applications were being used. And then also I was told, and part of their presentation, and I fully admit part of this was pilfered from the HCPUF information, which Tim Cortez gave me the go-ahead pilfer. Some of them are even homegrown tools. And so again, that's probably not the best way to collect accurate data. So there seemed to be the difference between reliability and validity. Some of the other problems with having multiple tools, we all know there's misinformation. We've talked about for years that we needed some kind of universal system, universal application. I know we like those for schools, we like those for everything. So we really did need to have some kind of universal system. And part of that is because from a family standpoint, I get tired of telling the same story over and over, and I'm sure you're tired of hearing me say it over and over. But I mean, even from getting services, having to explain the same thing for the same time so I won't belittle that or continue that. Also, the current tool is limited in scope, and it doesn't really collect all the data that we actually need. Part of that too is the new, I don't know what word to use now since we're not using tool. The new process will now collect additional data about what kind of supports there are. It'll actually even collect data about the caregivers themselves. And since we are supposed to be driving home person-centered planning, we're going to also start looking at those personal preferences and interests, not only for children, but adults. So this is just kind of a timeline of when we met. We actually started meeting in March. We tried to meet every month, having several meetings for several hours. So this just kind of gives you an indication of the investment that was made by the folks in the room. I'll just say that Laura and Dennis are here. They're two of the children's waiver managers. So I'm sure if I say anything incorrectly, they will call me on it. So the reason why I put tool underlined is, again, because we really want to get away from the idea that it's a tool. We really want to start focusing on the idea that this is a process. We're going to be looking at eligibility, not only for adults, but children. And so again, if we're looking at how we can move this forward, it has to really be person-centered. So we want it to be universal for adults and children. It can be used for any kind of a disability, whether it's physical, developmental, whatever. It also helps to work within the other projects that are going on. And I just listed one just because I happen to participate in it. But it does work within the scope of like the no wrong doors and making sure that when people come into the system, they really do get that one door and there is no wrong door. And that whoever does the eligibility determination should be able to move that person in the right place from the very beginning, instead of having to go from place to place to place and again repeat those stories. Again, it's person-centered. It's also supposed to enhance self-direction. Again, that's what we're all talking about here: going to college, washing cars, working on cars, whatever your self-direction is, that's what this is about. And at a younger age, I think that's what we're talking about too, is, we're not going to wait until we're 21 and done with, life skills through high school. Let's start at 14 and let's start moving them in that direction beforehand. We're going to also merge the eligibility and the support plan. Again, those used to be separate, so that, you'd kind of work on, are you eligible? And then we'll work on, how that's going to look. Now with this whole process, it'll come together. One of the things that Carol and I talked about extensively in this is, and you heard today, there's so much data that is not being collected. I know it's not being collected in school, it's not being collected everywhere. So one of the things that we talked about was respite. And you know, when you go to the Joint Budget Commission and they say, well, where's your data? And we said, but we don't have any money for the data. Well, but show me the data. And you end up in this cyclical kind of discussion. So what we're hoping with this new process is that we will already be collecting that data to show where the gaps are, the need for respite, where person-centeredness isn't happening, whatever those needs are. We're hoping that, so even if we can't address those needs immediately because of eligibility or targeting or whatever, at least we will now hopefully have that data, or they will have the data to move forward to show where the deficiencies are, and in service delivery models. So what is the new tool going to look like? Again, I should have taken out tool at this point, process. So this is just to give you an idea. Hopefully it's not too small. It's also in the PowerPoint. This again was taken straight out of the work plan that we did. You can kind of see that it talks about intake and how we move through the different systems. And don't worry, I'll move to the next slide. It'll be better. So these are the modules that we talked about: intake, introduction, participant record. And I'm not going to read through these. Just know that some of these records are voluntary, like the personal story. So if you didn't want to do that module for this process, that one is voluntary. Some of the other ones are not voluntary. I mean, that's part of the eligibility process, but you can kind of see how it's changed. I know one of the concerns was length. I can tell you, even right now, when we did our eligibility, our resource coordinator was at our house for 4 hours. So will this get better? I don't know. I think we will certainly have a better idea of the need of the people coming into the system, though. So this is just to give you a glimpse of what the things we actually looked like, what it looked like that we were working on. You can see down at the bottom, this one was taken from the functioning module. And so we just really started to tease out all the different areas that were available, like in a chair to bed, chair transfer. You can see that some of them are highlighted in orange. Those were actually things that were taken that are different either from like the adult or that were changed. And I didn't bring up the one slide because, as Carol said, I'll give you a link. You guys can go play with it for days. I just wanted you to see what we saw. This is taken from the Psychosocial Module. You can see we really tried to capture much, much more data. What it looks, what's the functioning impact, does it do things, what does it look like? You can see there are strike-throughs that we've changed that were part of the process. The things like the orange were added because we know a lot of people have food issues. We really just tried to make it as comprehensive without having it be a 50-page, and I don't know how long it is, being more excessive than necessary. And that's why you'll see in every box there's an other. An other is there to capture anything that isn't specifically called out. So again, this is just to give you an idea of what we were looking at and what we tried to tease out. So what's the timeline? I know everyone loves timelines. Actually, believe it or not, again, Tim Cortez actually forwarded me and gave me permission to put out this timeline. This is directly from the department. So you can see that if you're working from the top, the review of the operations, it goes down into the 2016-17, which we've already completed. This new process will actually go into a pilot first. So again, this is not something that's going to be rolled out very quickly. Again, it's going to take a lot of stakeholder input, a lot of your feedback, a lot of data collection. So you can see that we're already in the we're looking at the tool for the second box under 2016-17. It says adapting tool for children. That's where we are already finished. The implementation plan is where we're moving forward. And then you'll see in 2017, probably fall, will become the automation. And so a lot of it is also just the IT process around that automation and seeing what will work and what won't. Again, looking at the study, piloting, And then you can see moving out even further at the bottom, resource allocation. And he also included for us where the different funding would be coming from, so that if anyone wanted to geek out on where the money's coming from, that's where it's at. And you can actually see that in the red box in 2020, what does that red box say? It's unfunded at this point. So again, like Carol says, fight like hell. Try and get that money, make sure that it's there so that we have new processes in place. So how can you get your hands on this kind of information? Well, it's in the PowerPoint. You can also go to the Colorado Assessment Tool Development blog. That is actually the link. It actually has tons and tons of data, tabs. It also includes all of the adult stuff that has already taken place. All of those meetings, statewide meetings, have already finished as far as you're frowning. As far as in June, they're all finished. Andrew's just the one from HCBS Strategies who was the one who's working with us. They're done, so I don't know that he would be a great contact. Tim is also, of course, just the manager that's working on the program. You can obviously contact any of the waiver managers, since this will affect everyone, adults and children. But so if you wanted to look at the assessment blog, really is quite comprehensive, and it'll give you everything you need to know. One of the things that we did, I'll finish up, talk about is what's the name. We like acronyms. We like calling things things. By the time I left, there was no name. Maybe, okay, so there's still no name. We tried to come up with words that we thought embodied what we were looking to accomplish. Again, taking out tool, taking out those kind of things. We looked at Colorado, long-term care, universal, eligibility. So if any of y'all can come up with a great acronym, I'm sure the department would love to hear it. We got some like CASPER, LAP, CLAP, CUP. We got some very unique CLASS, CLASS. So we did come up with some unique acronyms. And so if you have anything that you can think of that embodies eligibility, assessments, applications, long-term, Colorado, whatever, feel free to move that on to the department. That's it. Any questions? I know, I want to give Jeanette enough time to do her spiel too. Yeah, sorry. I assume everyone knows Jeanette. So this is Jeanette Cordova. She's formerly of the executive director of El Grupo Vida. She's now moved on to the Spark program. She also has her own consulting firm, whatever, business. And she actually is also a research assistant here. Is it at JFK? Yes. At JFK? Well, I was thinking the university, but I wanted to specifically call out JFK. And she's actually going to talk about one of her projects that she just finished working on as well. So welcome.
Thanks. Hi, everybody. I'm going to use mine for, I don't know, when you present, I don't know if you're like me, but I changed my slides up until the night or even a few minutes before. So I'll use my notes from my slides. But so she pretty much introduced me, which is great. Shannon and I have known each other for a long time. And I'm kind of like her. I wear a lot of different hats. And when I'm speaking, I'm going to tell you which hat I'm wearing, if it's mom, or if it was the researcher as part of my project. So as part of the LEND project, I decided that what I wanted to do was create a health literacy training for families. And my LEND team said, we can't just put the burden on adapting to the barriers that families face. We need to include professionals to help with smoothing that process and smoothing out those barriers. So we created 2 trainings which were conducted in May. Can't go through the whole thing, so I'm giving you the highlights of a 2-year project that I did with Dr. Eric Moody at JFK Services, which was a CCTSI grant. Oh God, and I can't remember the acronym for that, but not enough time to go through that. But I wanted to give you the highlights of what the parents' feelings and perceptions were of the barriers that they face to access of care for their children with autism. So she kind of said it. I'm a parent of a person who is chromosomally enhanced, AKA person with Down syndrome. I'm going to finish my LEND fellowship at the end of this month, so I'm so excited to do my final report on my project. I started the first Spanish-speaking support group for Rocky Mountain Down Syndrome, Corazón del Amor, that's still currently going on. And now I am really happy to say it's being led by a sibling of a person with Down syndrome, which is really cool. I've been working with these Hispanic, Latino, and I'll explain this long name, Hispanic, Latino, Spanish-speaking community for over 14 years. I started a year into the birth of my kid working in the community. So the CCTSI grant was year 1 and 2, and it was myself as an executive director of El Grupo Vida and Dr. Eric Mooney, which everyone should know, but there's his info. So the first year pretty much allowed us to kind of create a real solidified working relationship for working with the Hispanic, Latino, and Spanish-speaking families. So from now on, I'll say HLSS. So our initial goal in year 1 was to bring Spanish-speaking stakeholders and community members with professionals. And we found out really quick that's not going to happen. Professionals have certain hours of the day that they work and they're able to attend things. And families, it's really hard to get them in on certain times. It was much easier to get families in during the day when the kids are in school. So that never really worked out. So we chose to have meetings at different times. And so we had focus groups for both. And we have a stakeholder advisory committee that is currently still active, and we'll be meeting with them in the fall to kind of give them an update. The work I did on this and the work that I'm continuing to do, I'm doing on my own because I feel it is important to keep this dialogue going with the professionals and parents in the community of how we can bridge the gap between those barriers and help these families access the services and supports they need early. Data was collected from year 1 and year 2 collaborative grant. Our stakeholder advisory consists of 4 parents with children with ASD, a person from CDPHE, and 2 from JFK. We did 2 focus groups with parents and 2 focus groups with professionals. We also collected data, the nice advantage of being the ED of El Grupo Vida. We collected data through the evaluations that were conducted at all of the support groups as well. And then I collected data from the Bridging the Gap workshop with the parents, which was on May 15th. We had 8 parents, which I was actually happy for because it was right around the end, school's ending, and parents are really busy. So it was really good. And what was really nice is we had some that did not have just ASD. It was also a couple of parents with Down syndrome. Why do we say Hispanic, Latino, and or Spanish speaking? So usually I make this interactive because everybody can kind of have fun with it, but we won't. Essentially, it's how we identify. I do not identify as Hispanic. My ancestry is from the Caribbean islands, which is identified as Latino. Some families, young people, identify as Spanish speaking. They don't identify as Hispanic or Latino because they were born and raised here, so they feel they're American. We didn't want anybody in the HLSS community to feel left out. If you don't speak Spanish, but you're Hispanic and identify that way, we wanted you to participate. So that is how we refer to our families now. So biases, we all have them. Raise your hand if you don't. Okay, cool. So some of the cultural areas that kind of came up through what we were learning is the cultural perceptions, bias, lack of cultural sensitivity. Again, these are as identified by the families and professionals that we worked with during the 2-year program, not me. Okay, I'll tell you which ones are mine or share examples. Oh, and I passed myself there. Let's see what else. Assumptions of cultural stigma, so lack of education because of a Latino last name. Professionals who are, so this one really floored me as a Latina woman who's been working in the community and working really well with our Hispanic families and being really accepted by familias who are of different ethnicity, Puerto Rican, Salvadorian, Mexican. It really knocked me for a loop that one of the biggest complaints the families had as a barrier are people who are themselves Hispanic, Latino, or Spanish speaking that don't help and actually discriminate against our families. They actually find American speakers to be more friendly and more helpful in the community. So that was something that really knocked myself and my co-investigators for a loop. Assumption that the family is non-compliant. This is a big one, and I have a perfect example. We had a mom who attended my workshop, and she said, "Oh my God, I just realized what I did," as I was talking about who diagnoses autism spectrum versus who does other diagnostics. And she said, "I canceled the appointment for an evaluation for ASD. I was told to go to a psychologist, and I thought, my son is not crazy. Why do I need to take him to a psychologist?" So talk about a real language barrier, but just an explanation barrier. That was a cultural piece that in the Mexican culture, if you're sent to a psychologist, tú estás loco, you're crazy. So she canceled the appointment, which had taken forever. And so immediately that day she left and rescheduled it because she realized her mistake. And so that family would have been viewed as non-compliant by not following through with her appointment, but it was really she didn't understand why a psychologist was important to do that diagnosis. These were pretty, language is always the first one. Hello, that's easy. Insurance and Medicaid barriers, but the one I want to highlight on this slide is SSI. So in our current climate of immigration issues, many families are afraid to apply for SSI now. They're even afraid to just show up to the office to take their paycheck stubs. So I have some families who are taking someone with them to help them and talk for them. So that way when they're asked their immigration status, the other person can say you can't legally ask that because it's irrelevant. It is the child's legal status that is important and their SSI. So, and a few families have been threatened with deportation by some of the SSI workers. On the professionals, and these were geared more towards medical therapists, community center boards. Again, I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but the two I wanted to highlight was not listening to concerns of the parents when they knew there was something wrong. I had one family who their daughter wasn't diagnosed until 13 because every time she asked this physician to do a diagnostic for autism, was told, "Why do you need another label?" And the difference that it's made to that family since the autism diagnosis is, one, the access of tools that they needed to be able to do the therapies that this person needed. And since diagnosed at 13, and she's now 16, she is now verbal and communicating more, less how's the easy word to say it, less behavioral issues because she's actually been getting ABA. And so it's made a huge, huge difference. So that was a big one that I wanted to highlight. The other one that was more specific to the community center board was asking need versus helping to suggest what they need. 15 years ago, I had community center board, Rocky Mountain, come to my house and say, "What do you need?" I had just had a child, my first. I had just found out he had Down syndrome. I had just found out he had a heart condition. Do you think I knew what I needed at that point? Unfortunately, even today, families are being asked what they need versus looking at the family in a holistic way and suggesting the supports and services that they need. So that was a big one that came up for the families, which was really sad for me to hear that they're still experiencing that 15 years later from when I came into it. I'm getting hot again and I left my fan over there. Sorry, hot flashes. Okay. All right, move it along. On this one, the real one I wanted to talk about is therapies who do not speak Spanish. Big barrier. Families are the caregivers 24/7. If they can't communicate with the therapist and the therapist can't communicate the ways that they can work with their child, how can they support that child or keep the therapy going as part of their daily routine? So what can we do? Encourage people to take Spanish. It's really not too hard to learn, and it would go very far. These are more directed to schools. We had quite a bit on the school level compared to the professional, to the medicals and stuff. And so the one I wanted to highlight here, again, school level as well, lack of listening to them about and ignoring requests for evaluations. We had a family turn in just recently, they were at the training as well, just recently in February turned in a request for a special education evaluation. It was ignored and they scheduled a Section 504. So I attended the Section 504 and said, well, Mom asked for a special education evaluation. And they were like, oh, really? Okay, let's get the special ed person in. Well, it's not a public school, it's a charter school, so they don't work in the summer, so they're like, well, we can't do it. And I'm like, well, then the district will do it. And sure enough, they're doing the evaluation during the district. This mom has been trying to get an evaluation to get an actual, both medical and evaluation at school for about a year and a half. And so hopefully now we'll find out if he's eligible. Another big one that I think for many in this room may not come as a surprise is families indicated that a lot of the bullying comes from some teachers themselves, and then the students kind of follow the norm of the classroom created by that teacher. So that was another big one that families kind of talked about. Again, the big one for schools is immigration. A lot of them reported of staff at the school level basically saying you get what you get or we'll call immigration. Yeah, still to this moment. So, and then the other big one is not providing the IEP in parents' language. There is no reason at all that in the 6 or so counties around Denver metro area that they cannot provide this in Spanish. The law requires that it's provided in Spanish. A little vague as to how long it should take, but Randy Chapman, who I love to pick his brain about, said really 3 to 4 weeks is when they should have it. So that was another one. That's really hard. How do they understand anything if it's not coming in their own language? Interpreters was another big one that the families kind of talked about. So the two that I want to talk about is, and Dina can come up here to help me. One is different dialects. I am Puerto Rican. I do not speak the same Spanish as a person from Mexico or other areas. We have different words for different things for different meanings. The assumption that all Spanish is the same is a wrong assumption. And that has been a big issue when interpreting, because the interpreter may not know what the mom's trying to say because she doesn't understand that particular dialect. So that was a big one. Then there's simultaneous versus non-simultaneous. So if you would read that, just read this.
Okay. Interpreting simultaneously
Interpretando la misma vez. Keep talking.
versus non-simultaneous.
Interpretando la misma vez es esto lo que
Parents
estoy haciendo
feel
en este momento.
they should be asked.
This is simultaneous interpreting. Did you understand what I was saying? Did you understand what Dina was saying? I couldn't even hear myself. This is how they interpret, especially on the school level. Is that bizarre? So the family said that what they would really appreciate is, and this was interpretation broadly, medical, therapeutic, whatever, ask them how they prefer. Because I've been in those meetings with simultaneous. That is great for a conference. To have somebody in the back doing it simultaneous is great. But it's not interrupting the other speakers and other listeners, and it's not interrupting the families from really getting everything. So that was the biggest one. And they do that in an IEP meeting. It is so frustrating. So we had to kind of explain to families, when they do that, you stop the meeting and you say that you do not want simultaneous. What's the problem? They're trained to only do simultaneous. I learned how to do non-simultaneous. I could not do a conference and do simultaneous. That's not my training. My training is to hear the person and then do it. So big, big barrier. Let's see. This one is a big one. And during the training with interpreters, I think they had a really hard time with this one, and I get it. Parents feel that the interpretation is more direct interpretation versus interpreting the meaning and feelings the parents are trying to express. Unfortunately, that is parents' assumption that that's what interpreters should do, but that is not what interpreters are trained to do. However, I looked up interpretation rules and regs, and interpreters are to serve as advocates. So if they're translating something in a way that the family is not talking about, that interpreter does have the right to advocate that the medical person or the school person explain it in a way that is going to be easier to interpret for the family. So that was a big one, and I hope to be working with the children's interpreters to kind of talk more about how we can kind of work through these issues, because there's a lot of protocol, etc., that causes hindrance, and we just need to kind of work together with the parents to really bridge that. Can you wait till I'm almost done? Cool, okay, thanks. This one is a big one that families really wanted to know. We think about system barriers, but do we ever think about family barriers? So the big one here is not really understanding what their first steps are after diagnosis. And what we've learned in these 2-year grant is that families who receive an initial diagnosis, whether it's at birth, whether it's at 13 or after, need a little bit more hand-holding during that first year, because they are grieving that diagnosis. And instead of this handing, which I'll talk about later, handing the information, sometimes we need to do a warm handoff. You can read the rest. The others kind of cross the board for families of people with disabilities: compromised quality of life, unpredictable outcomes, reduced community interaction, mental health concerns, etc. I do want to highlight parent roles. We put a lot of stress on moms. I don't care if you're Hispanic or not. We put a lot of stress on moms. They are usually the main caregivers of the children because dad's working, dad's providing, and especially in the Latino culture, Hispanic Latino HLSS community, moms are the key ones. And so another reason why moms can become non-compliant is they are too overwhelmed to take on what we as professionals want them to do. And so sometimes they need a little bit more hand-holding during that time, or warm handoffs during that time. Fathers, a lot reported lack of acceptance of the diagnosis and lack of providing help, and the extended family. So we wanted to give you some of that information. So some of the tips that the families came up with is ask the family how their culture views disability, because that's a big one to know if that family is going to be heavy into grieving, have the issues with dad not accepting diagnosis. Mexican culture, disability is viewed as mom did something wrong, and they hide their kids. So that kind of beginning dialogue when you're first giving a family an evaluation is really key. The other one I really want to highlight is one I've been doing for 14 years, warm handoff. I do not say, here's the info, call. When they're on the phone with me, I will transfer them to who they need. Or if they're at a point where they can't, I will get permission, have them sign a form, and I will get the referrals and then have the agencies call them. Because the reality is, during that first year especially, they are not going to contact all the resources. And you've got families who don't connect sometimes to a CCB until 1 to 2 years later, because They didn't realize that was important. The other thing is not knowing that the community center boards service their kid if they're eligible throughout the lifespan. They think once they're done with early intervention, the community center board doesn't do anything. So that was another big one. Mental health resources to help those families grieving. Make those connections. Therapists, don't say psicólogo, don't say psychologist, don't say psychiatrist, say a therapist. It's a much gentler word and much better for families to hear if you're recommending that they do that. If you are a staff person who helps family with resources, please, I'm begging everybody, learn the resources that are available to the kids that are not born here. They do have the right to school, and that's from 3 to 21 if they have an eligible diagnosis and receive an IEP. They can stay in school until 21. What happens to the kids after 21 is they sit at home. There's nothing more, unless they get DACA, deferred action, which allows them to work, if they can work. The other is they are eligible for EI and community center board services up until 18. And I have had so many families whose kids have gotten to 17 and have never received any supports and services. And they are entitled to this. Those young people are entitled to this, and we need to make sure they connect. Refer the families to the organizations that are really supporting this population, which is El Grupo Vida and Family Voices. So my final thought is to work with the HLS community. It takes time to build trust, but it's worth the extra time and effort in the long run, both for families and professionals. I can't tell you how much our community loves Dr. Moody because he takes the time with them. He's taken 2 years to really get to know them. And so when he's presenting, we have a full house. So it's amazing, and he just did it with basically 1 year of putting in the time in these meetings and meeting these families and presenting to them. It is very rewarding work, but it does take a lot longer than working with the regular population. So if you have any questions or anything like that, my information is there. Thank you. Yes, Donna, question.
I have an acquaintance who is an
Mm-hmm.
interpreter through Children's Hospital, and she will sometimes come down and other times do it over the telephone. And so I wanted to share these slides with her. Really, really am glad that you made this presentation today. I would like her to hear some of the things that you've said are important, and I'm sure she'd nod her head if she were in the room. But also, I'm really concerned that she know about the disability services availability. People who haven't come out because she thinks.
Yeah, I'm really, really excited to be working with the interpreters in August. I'll be meeting with them. And basically, it's really to hear about their experiences. So then I can really look at the interpreters' experiences and point of view, and then we can maybe start a dialogue on where can we bridge that, I think a lot of the issues may be protocols, but we won't know until we actually sit down and talk. So I'm just so excited about my continuing project. That's not going to end ever.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Thank you to all our speakers. Thank you to those of you who are here today. Our next meeting will be the second Friday in September, and we look forward to seeing you. Have a great summer. Thanks.